Well, it's great to see you all. I'm so glad you could come to Humanities Day, and I'm very honored that you chose to come to this talk on Bob Dylan. This is, for me, I'm Steve Rings. I'm a music theorist in the music department. This is my current central area of research. I've published already on quite different topics, and my first book I was just discussing with some members of the audience is on something quite different, which is a branch of mathematical music theory. This is my first sort of post-tenure receiving project, and I'm very excited to be embarking on it. So interpret that as you will. And you'll be hearing a lot of my thoughts, things I've been thinking about regarding Dylan's voice, certain ideas for the book I'm beginning, which is on Dylan's performing career, in particular the way his performances of songs have changed over 50 years. So we'll be doing a little comparison with that. The talk is going to have three parts. First, we will survey some of Dylan's many, many voices. And I will situate those within the particular eras of his career, point out certain stylistic details, and so on. The middle part will be somewhat more theoretical or conceptual, with certain philosophical ideas about the nature of the voice and particular issues that arise when thinking about Dylan's voices. And then the final part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the methodological challenges that face a scholar who wishes to find ways to engage with Dylan's voices in terms of analytical representations. This is very challenging to do, and so I'm going to show you some of the techniques that I employ for that. And then I will look forward to your questions. So we'll begin with part one. For a long time, I've tried not to have paper titles that have two parts in them with a colon in the middle, which is sort of a habit of academics. It's really hard when you're writing about Bob Dylan, because any topic that you think of, there are about half a dozen lines that are so resonant. I mean, this is a wildly prolific and quotable figure. And so I couldn't resist this time and drew my line from the fifth verse of the 1965 song, Ballad of a Thin Man. And here it is, you see it at the end of the verse there before the refrain. So let's give this a quick listen as it was recorded for the famous record, Highway 61 Revisited.
So I swallow what he comes up to you, and then he kneels. He crosses himself, and then he clips his high heels. And without further notice, he asks you how it feels. And he says, here is your throat back, thanks for that long. And you know something is happening, but you don't know what it is.
All right, so poor Mr. Jones. This is this classic hipster sneer at the classic square, the hapless Mr. Jones, who seems to have wandered into some sort of bohemian hangout. He's probably, as far as we can tell, a journalist. He walks in with his pencil in his hand and so forth. And that, you know, who knows, some Greenwich Village basement hangout or something, which Dylan then refigures here in this classically surrealistic, almost Fellini-esque context, where we have, you know, one-eyed midgets and the geek and naked people running around, and of course, the sword swallower in this verse. I'm not especially interested in the hipster finger wagging here, which seems to me to be such an easy target. What interests me more is the signifying excess of Dylan's language, as always. This is the phase of the sort of greatest symbolist and surrealist experimentation in Dylan's writing in 1965, the first portion of the electric phase of his career. And here we have this wonderfully elliptical little verse. It's not exactly clear what has happened with Mr. Jones's throat. If the sword swallower has perhaps plunged his sword down Mr. Jones's throat or taken it out and so forth. But in any case, there's much that one could say about this in a literary criticism class about sort of the erotics of this moment, if you will. But I am instead going to be taking this as a little bit of Dylan's music that we can then hear him sing over the next 47 years. It's been 47 years since then. At current count, Dylan has performed Ballad of a Thin Man over 1,000 times. I think it's 1,033 times. Or, as of last night, 34. He does it every night now, by the way. It's a big spotlight number on the tour now. He stands center stage without an instrument, and there's an echo on his voice and so forth. So what I want to do is sample his performances of the song over this 45-year period, 47 years, and we'll move over it in 3 big strides of about 15 years each. So we'll start with a performance right after the record came out in 1966. This is the famous, very confrontational tour where Dylan would play the first half acoustic and the second half electric. And here he is in Manchester, a very famous, storied concert. So there's also obviously a signifying excess of the voice here, too. Dylan's particular voice seems to strain against these words. This is the first moment also in this 1966 tour where we start getting that very characteristic aspect of Dylan's singing, which is sort of a parabolic contour to every syllable. Every vowel gets its own kind of bell shape. Here's your throat back. Thanks for the loan. And this enters various phases of more or less nasalized production and so forth. In the 80s, it takes on a very particular characteristic. We will actually zoom forward then, 15 years to 1981. Here he is in New Orleans, November 1981. This is during the so-called gospel phase for Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan converted to Christianity in 1979, released a couple gospel records. The tour before this one, he performed only songs from these gospel records. In this tour, he started adding in some of his old catalog from the 1960s. One of the things you will hear in his vocal performances here, first of all, slightly more nasal, but second of all, quite extraordinary soul and R&B influences in his singing. At this point, he had backup singers. He had a very big band. And so listen in particular to the little melisma he has on Lone. There are actually many details to listen to here, but that one in particular. These, by the way, this is another very confrontational period. These incredible exchanges with the audience, people shouting, Dylan giving very bizarre sermons and things. However, which are collected, there's a book actually of Dylan's stage raps from this era if you want to peruse those. Interestingly, though, these 1981 concerts now, by a lot of Dylan enthusiasts, are considered some of the greatest performances, extremely supercharged, high-octane performances. So going forward another 14 years here, Prague in 1995. Here we are about 7 years into what has been called the Never-Ending Tour, which starts in 1988. Dylan performed with the Grateful Dead a little bit, and he was feeling very wayward and lost in the 1980s. And the idea that he got from the Grateful Dead was to tour constantly and constantly reinvent his songs. And this reinvention finds expression, among other things, in his singing, which becomes highly experimental at this point in terms of phrasing, in terms of contour, in terms of rhythm, and we certainly hear that in this concert. All right, so that's 1995. One other thing I'll say that makes this particular survey, or this little potted history of Dylan's singing voice, useful with this song is typically Ballad of a Thin Man is sung in what I would consider more or less his default voice at a given era. So this gives us a good sample of sort of the central core in terms of the tone color, the timbre, and the phrasing at various points. And that's true for our last example, which is 2 months ago in my hometown of Rochester, Minnesota. I was at the show. I didn't make the recording. And so now we will hear Dylan's most recent voice, these kind of guttural bursts, extremely ragged, inspires journalists and critics to all sorts of fantastic adjectives. It's great fun to read. So this is, I'll mention the instruments are a little quiet, but Dylan's voice is louder. He can make a great use out of that growl at this point. It becomes almost kind of campy, Vincent Price kind of thing. Very, very spooky. All right, so that gives you some sense of what's happened with this voice over 5 decades. What I want to do now is go back and fill in some gaps. In particular, the most notable gap is the phase up to 1965. We haven't yet heard any of Dylan singing from his acoustic phase, from his Dinkytown, Minnesota phase, or early in Greenwich Village. So for this, I actually want to excerpt a little bit from this 2004 film that Martin Scorsese made called No Direction Home. It includes interview footage from Bob Dylan done in 2000 and a lot of fantastic side-by-side comparisons between singers and then Dylan's imitations of them. We notice this extraordinary, almost ventriloquist's ability that he has to imitate other singers. The first thing we're going to hear right when this clip starts is Odetta, the folk singer, singing a Jimmy Rogers song called Mule Skinner Blues. And so we'll hear her singing that, and then shortly thereafter, Dylan singing it in about 1961, 1960. And notice in particular the timbre of Dylan's voice, the tone color, this very rounded sound, which is quite different from the kind of oaky drawl that he would adopt.
I don't remember buying any records. If I went into a booth, I had a very agile mind. I could learn the song by maybe hearing it once or twice. I traded my electric equipment for an acoustic guitar. Started playing almost immediately.
All right, so there we hear just one voice. And remember that voice, this rounded, almost country voice. It will come back. There has actually been some speculation that this was Dylan's sort of most natural singing voice when he was younger. When you read contemporary reports, they talk about him having this beautiful, smooth-sounding voice. We actually have a whole recording that this is drawn from 1960 where you can hear this voice, and we'll hear it again. The next clip, This is going to start right in the middle. He's singing a song called Streets of Glory here. You'll hear just a snippet of it. This is a gospel tune sort of in the manner of the Carter family. And then we will hear other excerpts as well and other comparisons in this clip. Minnesota.
He sounded like average, I would say. He wasn't the worst, he wasn't the best, but the repertoire was similar to everybody else's repertoire. Josh White, Dada, Belafonte.
But I never had no goal except learning all the songs I could.
This is the Memphis Jug Band.
Just for money, not just for fame, but he was hungry for experience, for getting out, for doing it, for seeing what was out there, seeing who he could be.
This is quite amazing, this Irish voice.
He's like a sponge in a way, like pick up people's mannerisms, accents.
I forgot all about the anime where I grew up. I forgot about it all. Didn't even enter my mind.
Had a particular sound. And besides that, he said something to go along with his sound. That was highly unusual to my ears.
Jesus Christ was a man that traveled through the land, hard-working man and brave. But that dirty little coward named Judas Iscariot killed Jesus Christ in his grave.
He was a radical. His songs had a radical slant. That's what I was saying that.
All right. So we end up, of course, with the most famous individual whom Dylan modeled himself on in the early years of the 1960s is, of course, Woody Guthrie. So to hear a little bit more of Dylan's voice at this time, I want to play another recording from 1961, a song that was never released on any of the studio records called He Was a Friend of Mine. And here we hear both the Woody Guthrie voice, this kind of oaky twang, but also bits of Delta blues voices coming in here, especially when the vocal contour ascends. So listen to this. I also want you to pay attention to not only the obvious nasalizing, which becomes a characteristic of Dylan's singing in many of his phases, but also this tendency to move down into what we call the fry of the voice, the vocal fry, which is down here. If I talk like this, you can actually hear the individual adductions of the vocal folds. If I go, right? This is also called creaky voice by linguists. And Dylan uses this particular style of creaky voice here to age his voice. Keep in mind he's 20 years old at this point, and this is a very deliberate attempt to age his voice.
He was a friend of mine. He was a friend of mine.
Here comes a blues.
Every time I think about him now, thought I just can't keep from crying. 'Cause he was a friend of mine.
All right, so that voice eventually evolves into that 1965 voice that we heard in the first Ballad of a Thin Man, where he loses some of the very explicitly Woody Guthrie inflections, but it becomes that sort of sneer that we heard, which Philip Larkin called the cawing, derisive voice of Dylan in 1965. But there remain these exceptional voices that will appear later in his career. So we have just two more examples that I want to play before ending this survey. The first comes from this record, Nashville Skyline, in 1969. This record included the most famous song off of it is Lay Lady Lay, which you might know. And here, lo and behold, that rounded sort of country crooner voice comes back. So in place of creaky voice and the fry and that nasalized sound, all of the overemphasized plosives and things that he does to imitate Woody Guthrie, here we have this strangely bell-like kind of sound to the voice, very peculiar, and it's hard to place what the source is here if Dylan is imitating someone. It's slightly a little Roy Orbison, maybe almost a little Ernest Tubb or Hank Snow or something like that, but not really. In fact, the source, I think the most proximate source, is a little more surprising. Here we are in the same year.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone. Without a drink in my heart. Without love of my own.
All right. And here we are. Exactly the same key, exactly the same pitches.
You saw me standing alone. Without a dream in my heart. Without love of my own.
Now, this is especially interesting because in the initial reception of Dylan and also in his own kind of self-fashioning or presenting of his own image, there was no real explicit link made between Dylan and pop singers in the 1950s. Indeed, the folk revival, many of these figures established themselves very much in opposition to mainstream popular music. But Dylan adored 1950s popular music, and indeed even earlier popular music going all the way back to the Andrews Sisters and things like this. And so we see influences of that today, but here we have him doing Elvis in 1969. Last voice, this is a crazy outlier. One More Cup of Coffee, 1976. Dylan has also said that he listens widely to non-Western singers, and one of them is an Egyptian singer named Kulthum, who is one of the most famous singers in Egypt. And here we get this extraordinary Middle Eastern voice. All right, so there I'll end my survey of these voices, and to transition into the next section of the talk, we'll listen to Dylan's own comments a couple years later. He says, "You can do anything with your voice if you put your mind to it. I mean, you can become a ventriloquist, or you can become an imitator of other people's voices. I'm usually just stuck with my own voice. I can do a few other people's voices." I love the kind of dialectical doubling back of this passage, which is at first complete sort of freedom and flexibility and malleability. You can do anything. You can imitate anyone. Well, I just have my own voice, but I can do some other voices. And in fact, I think this is really an interesting way to get into some broader theoretical issues with Dylan's voice, that we have this kind of dialectic between a sort of highly characteristic Dylan sound, which is nevertheless constantly in circulation with all of these other mimetic imitations of other individuals' voices. Philosopher Adriana Cavarero has a book on the voice, and she talks about the voice being the site of one sort of most individual character. One sort of inner essence is revealed by the voice, and she draws on Plato and Aristotle and so forth. And there is a sense in which Dylan is arguably one of the most recognizable singers in just that sense in Western musical culture of the last 50 years. You play a few seconds of any bit of Dylan, and anyone who has heard him will immediately know whose voice that is. And yet, very often at these moments, Dylan is doing his utmost to imitate other singers. So there's this very peculiar kind of dialectic that's going on between imitation and a certain kind of unquestionably Bob Dylan sound. And I would say through all of those examples that we just heard, with perhaps the exception of Blue Moon, you can't mistake that it's Bob Dylan singing. And yet that Bob Dylan persona is emerging through these other voices, through a Woody Guthrie voice, through an Elvis voice, through Kulthum, and so forth. And so this leads to all sorts of fascinating questions that Dylan scholars love to think about masks and various kinds of personae that Dylan puts on and how these are manifested through the voice. And I think one can go too far with that, and Bob Dylan himself becomes kind of an empty vessel. There's no actual human being there. There's no biology. There is just this performance of imitation. And I think what fascinates the most about him is the way in which, through all of that imitation, it's almost as though when Dylan is bending his efforts most strongly to imitate others, that he sounds most like himself. And this relates to another issue which has to do with the relationship between the words and the singing. Here we have a statement from Sam Cooke to his backup singer at the time, Bobby Womack, around the time Dylan's first records came out. From now on, it's not going to be about how pretty the voice is. It's going to be about believing that the voice is telling the truth. And as you likely know, Sam Cooke then went on to record a song called Change Is Gonna Come, which is explicitly based on Dylan, Times They Are A-Changin', most obviously. And Sam Cooke, of course, being one of the most celebrated soul singers at the time, an extraordinary singer, but not extraordinary in the ways that Dylan is extraordinary. And he was allegedly very struck by Dylan's style and said that there's something about the way in which he's singing that people tended to believe that it was true. There's a kind of marker of authenticity there somehow. And here we think about all of those discussions of Dylan as the voice of a generation at the time, right? Speaking the truth somehow. And it's fascinating. I've never actually quite known with that locution, the voice of a generation, how much this means the words to Blowin' in the Wind, and how much it means that voice, that particular sound. I think there's actually a fascinating story in Dylan reception history to tell that would look at the contrast between those two, which we might call, drawing on another philosopher, a dialectic between phonos, or voice, and logos, or the word. And here, this is a long tradition. This philosopher Mladen Dolar has traced this back to Plato, Aristotle, the scholastics, Augustine, and so forth. This sense of discomfort with the kind of excess that the voice presents and the way in which the voice cannot always be captured by metaphysics or by translated into sort of discursive meaning. But instead, the voice presents a kind of excess that threatens that. And there are all sorts of fascinating moments in Dylan reception, especially early on, where you hear very familiar things like, oh, yeah, he's a great poet. You know, the words are great, but his singing is terrible. And so this is a very common thing, right? Dylan can't sing. It's a big part of the early reception history, and indeed it still pops up now and then. So an attempt to cleave off Dylan the lyricist from Dylan the singer. And we see this articulated in various ways throughout his career. One of my favorite early quotes is from Woody Guthrie himself. That boy's got a voice. Maybe he won't make it with his writing, but he can sing it. He can really sing it. So not Woody Guthrie's most prescient prediction. But in any case, there we have right away a turning of the tables where, oh, he's a great singer. I don't know about those songs he's writing, but a fantastic singer. Dylan himself says fascinating things along these lines. In 1984, When I do whatever it is I'm doing, there is rhythm involved and there is phrasing involved. And that's where it all balances out, in the rhythm of it and the phrasing of it. It's not in the lyrics. People think it's in the lyrics. Maybe on the records it's in the lyrics. But in a live show, it's not all in the lyrics. It's in the phrasing and the dynamics and the rhythm. And so Dylan is here, again, trying to rewrite this balance between phonos and logos and trying to suggest that the voice can be a site of this aesthetic practice that doesn't need to be tied at all times to discursive meaning of the words. This is something that one can still read people trying to negotiate on, say, discussion boards on Dylan fan sites and things. You'll have discussions of how much do you pay attention to the words in Bob Dylan songs. You would imagine that all Bob Dylan fans are obsessives about the words, right? But it's quite striking. There are many people who say, oh, I listened to this song for years before I knew that it was about, a thunderstorm or something. And so in that case, we have plenty of instances of hardcore fans who focus on Dylan's voice as a voice, and there's this complex circulation between the various polysemous meanings of his words and the ways in which they're manifested in his singing. And so this leads me to the last part of my talk. I just want to briefly survey some of the ways in which, as a scholar, we can try to engage these particular nuances of rhythm and phrasing and so forth that Dylan mentions in this quote. If you read music, and if you've ever tried to notate music, you can imagine how extremely difficult it is to try to translate those types of singing into little ellipses on a musical staff, right? Very, very, very hard. The students in my seminar right now were working on exactly this in certain exercises that we're doing, trying to figure out what are the limits and what are the communicative potentials of traditional music notation. But it's very hard to do. One way we can make an end run around that is to use spectrographic imaging and have spectrograms of what's going on in the harmonic series when Dylan is singing. And so I want to show you a couple of those images and let you know a little bit how to read them. For this purpose, we'll use It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding from 1964.
Darkness at the break of noon, shadows, even the silver spoon. The handmaid played the child's balloon, eclipses both the sun and moon. To understand, you know too soon. There's no sense in trying.
So classic beat-inspired Bob Dylan here, trying on Allen Ginsberg in a sense. And here we have a spectrogram of the very first sung line. So let me explain a little bit what you're seeing here. Any pitched sound from most resonating instruments such as the voice is not merely a single frequency, but it is a frequency that has periodic repetitions in what we call the overtone series. So even though I may play a single key on the piano, and our ear synthesizes that pitch into one focal pitch that we call the fundamental, what gives the fundamental color and character and so forth is what's going on up above it in what we call the harmonic stack or the harmonic series. And so we can see this here with Dylan singing. Look at every syllable. You see many lines up there. What we call the fundamental is right down here. This is darkness at the break of noon right here. So that's a low E. It's the E below middle C for those keeping track. But notice that then we have all of these other partials up above this. We call this the first fundamental or the first partial, and then the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, etc. And so one thing that we can do is see what's going on in both the fundamental and those upper partials at any given moment when Dylan is singing. Now, at this particular phase, Dylan is still very much in kind of a nasal singing phase. And what you notice is that the fundamental itself is actually very weak here. The brightness of the red lets you know how much energy there is at that given fundamental or at that given partial. Here it's very weak, but we have a real emphasis right here from partials about 4 through 8 or something like that, 4 through 10 maybe. And that is part of the signature, the thumbprint, if you will, of that sound, darkness at the break of noon, sung in that particular way. We get this real emphasis on mid-range parcels for that ah vowel, given that nasalized coloring. A couple other things that we can see from a spectrogram like this are, for one, contour of how these given pitches are sung. Keep in mind, if I were writing this on staff paper, dark, that bit, it would get one note head, right? Oh, that's all you can do. You know, I could try to squiggle around it to suggest something. But here we do see very clearly this very slight arch shape that we get to the pitch. Similarly for noon, we get a little arch shape like that. So keep that in mind when we're comparing this to other performances. All right, so there it is. Here we are a few months before, actually, one of the first live performances of the song, Halloween 1964. This, by the way, is the first concert when Dylan says something about a mask. He says, oh, I have my Bob Dylan mask on tonight, which everyone loves. You know, all the postmodern critics leap on that and then write a book about masks and so forth. In any case, here we have it. Now, there are great similarities here to what we just heard. Most notably, notice again, this is darkness. I'll play it for you in a second. Extremely weak fundamental, very strong in about partials 4 through 8 for darkness. Notice also the kind of slight curve to noon as well. Now, what's striking here is Dylan is singing in a different key. There's a very peculiar thing with this song. In the studio recording, he does it in the key of E. And the way you change this, by the way, it has to do with the guitar. It's just a capo. So he has a capo on the 2nd fret in the studio. But in all the live performances, he does it in G. And so it's higher, capo on the 5th fret. In fact, I've surveyed about 800 performances of this song. He never once performs it live in the key in which it is on the studio recording, which is crazy. And even right before, he's performing it in G in concert, goes into the studio, does it in E, goes right back out and performs again, and he does it in G. In part, this is because of how it's quite different to sing for a microphone in the studio than to sing in a hall and project. When he pitches it higher, he can punch through a lot more in a big space. Whereas with a microphone, less energy is needed. The lungs don't have to do as much. But in any case, even with that different pitch, there's much similarity here.
Darkness at the break of noon. Darkness at the break of noon.
Okay, so you see a rather striking similarity. There's one other thing that we can notice that's a little different in the rhythm. Look at of. Break of gets sort of a two-syllable thing here, whereas here it's very quick. And so this is, again, another thing that we can read off of these that is very difficult to capture in traditional notation. Dylan will often do this, give allegedly one-syllable words a couple syllables. You know, throw in an aspirant, an H sound in the middle or something. All right, now let's listen to him sing the song in 1974. I just want to play the first verse. This is magnificent stuff. This is his return to touring. He took 8 years off, came back and did a tour in 1974, big arenas with the band behind him. And so here is how this looks. Very, very different. Now look at how strong the fundamental is throughout here, and how you don't have any of that stuff up above. And that gives you a little sense of how this is such a different timbre. We are a little bit closer here almost to that Nashville skyline sound. That slightly more rounded sound, more focused fundamental, less nasal, and so forth. The other thing you can really see is how consistent the pitch is. You don't have these little waves anymore. You have these sustained pitches throughout. Again, something that we couldn't capture with traditional notation. There it is. Okay, and then let's compare this to Blue Moon, just so we can see what Blue Moon looks like. Again, extremely strong fundamental.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone.
And you can really see alone. That's nice, right there. Okay, let's compare it to Elvis. So there's Elvis. Here's Dylan again.
Blue moon, you saw me standing alone.
And then here's Elvis. Now, some obvious differences, but also some really extraordinary similarities. Right here, certainly with that fundamental here and here. Dylan hams up this part. Elvis is very cool in that moment. So I just want to end then showing you an image of Dylan's voice now. Here we are. This is our performance from Rochester, Minnesota, from 2 months ago. Now, one thing to notice, first of all, this is a bootleg recording, and so there's quite a bit of noise in general in the recording. But still, we can see a lot of these sounds down here. That's not his singing, that's just the band. Instead, what we get for the voice are these ragged splotches up here in the top, which indicate this extremely gravelly voice that he has now. And let's listen. Again, the voice is louder than the instruments. So here's thanks right there. Okay, it's this sort of splotch up here. Fundamental is almost completely gone. And instead we have all of this extremely ragged activity up in the upper partials, which is what gives it this particular sound now. So that takes us up to where Dylan is now. I think it's interesting to note that he probably has the voice now that he always wanted, in a sense. If you read him talking about the Delta blues musicians whom he heard when he was growing up in Hibbing, he was utterly captivated by these sort of what he took as inscrutable voices. And now he certainly has an inscrutable voice, sort of the voice of an ancient singer. And he really uses it to its full potential in his current vocal practice, which, if you'd like, you can hear in a couple weeks at the United Center. He'll be here. So with that, I'm going to stop and take your questions. Thank you.